How is everybody doing? Welcome back to another episode of The Banker Next Door. I am your host, Dr. Joe Berquist. Today, I want to be talking to everybody about check fraud. As check fraud continues unabated across our economy and through our banking system, I came across a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, which basically asked the question, should we stop using checks, considering the fact that scammers are out there just really using this check fraud schemes constantly, costing banks and customers, particularly business customers, just endless headaches all the time. What can really be, how does the scam work, and what can really be done about this? So with that being said, let's bring in this article here real quick. And let's take a look at this. So this article is titled, We Can't Give Up Paper Checks, and that's a gold mine for scammers. Suspected fraudsters congregate anonymously on message boards and social media, figuring out which banks to target with altered checks. And let's see. And we get kind of an image here. This is kind of what you see on, so this is a Telegram message board. Hundreds of images show how stealing checks and then depositing them in bank accounts has become big business and a major headache for the financial, system. And basically, you can see Capital One, Bank of America targeted right here, where basically, you put fraudulent checks in and then you immediately withdraw cash. The check bounces, and like I said, we'll get into how this works here in just a second. But Americans can't quit paper checks. Fraudsters are cashing in. A message appeared this month on an app where people often congregate to trade tips on committing check fraud. It names some of the largest banks: TD, PNC, Citi, Now. That same week, anonymous posters sent photos to the same app showing ATM deposits from banks, including PNC. One slip showed a deposit check for $47,351. Scammers are altering checks, depositing them, and quickly withdrawing cash before banks flag the payments as suspicious, according to bank executives and their anti-fraud consultants. Fraudsters frequent Telegram, a popular messaging app, Facebook, and TikTok to promote the low-tech check scheme. The scams exploit banks' requirements to make customer money available before fully verifying checks. They have spread rapidly in the past few years, turning into a major headache for financial industry. Mentions of nearly every large bank, credit union, and brokerage spiked this year on Telegram channels where suspected fraudsters post tips, according to analysis by Frank McKinnon, chief strategist at Point Predictive, a fraud technology company. Financial firms are racing to stay ahead of it. JP Morgan Chase froze accounts, and Fidelity Investments imposed longer holds on some mobile deposits to crack down on the scheme. Representatives for PNC and Citigroup declined to comment on the Telegram messages about them. TD didn't have a comment. The fraudsters' social media messages suggest there are always potential new glitches to exploit. They move quickly from bank to bank, telling others of their latest targets and their successes. And then you see here, they have this really interesting chart here that says bank mentions on Telegram, top fraud channels. And the top banks that they have here are JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Discover, and Wells Fargo. And you can see by far the biggest one here is JP Morgan Chase with over 19,000, fraudulent channels, or, Bank of America, 12,784. I'm sorry, that was Discover, has 12,784. Bank of America had 14,719, coming in second, again, followed by Discover. And then Wells Fargo had 9,390. And you can see here that this has moved up and down. So about, 2022 activity was a lot smaller. It spiked up here in 23, came back down a little bit, but then has spiked back up again and is starting to come down a little bit here at the end of the year. But, still, a major problem. So, and the scammers have found a particularly American security hole: our reliance on paper checks. On average, there were some 30 checks per person written in the U.S. in 2021, nearly twice as many as the French, the world's second largest check users, according to the Federal Reserve. In many European countries, electronic payment networks have completely replaced paper checks, but a fragmented and slow to change U.S. banking system continues to cater to businesses, government offices, and individuals that prefer checks. Those checks end up in mailboxes and become easy targets for criminals. Most banks say you can never get rid of checks, McKinnon said. Check fraud went up nearly 400% last year. According to a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network report from September, more than 800 financial institutions, including banks and credit unions, filed reports indicating that they have been victims of mail theft-related check fraud, crimes that could cost these institutions about $688 million. The criminal side is much better at sharing or exchanging information, said Brett Johnson, once on the Federal Bureau of Investigation's most wanted list and now an advisor to companies and law enforcement. That's why the bad guys are winning this game. So, and how does this thing work? So the first step is to manipulate checks. And one common tactic, fraudsters steal checks from mailboxes and use household chemicals to wash out the amount and the recipient, writing in the name on the account they plan to access. Others turn to illicit marketplaces to buy books of blank checks or universal keys that open drop boxes outside post offices. We're not talking about skilled individuals, Johnson said. We're talking about people who understand that there's an opportunity. Next, the fraudsters deposit the checks, generally at ATMs. Federal rules say banks have 7 business days to challenge a check's validity before they must release the funds. If they suspect a check is counterfeit, banks can put it on hold and contact the financial institution that issued the check. Checks that are genuine but altered are much more likely to go unchallenged, but bank executives and fraud specialists said. Then finally, the account holder withdraws the amount in multiple transactions as the funds become available. They might visit a branch to take out some money, but buy a cashier's check to move another slice of the funds. So banks have been rolling out mobile deposits and giving customers the ability to immediately access deposited funds and transfer money. Fraud specialists say that makes it easier to pull money out before banks are aware that a crime has been committed. JP Morgan, the nation's largest bank, was targeted when fraudsters learned that banks had unwittingly allowed customers immediate access to all deposited funds. A scam is usually uncovered when the banks send requests to their check issuing counterparts to clear and wire the money. The issuing banks have 60 days to respond. And it goes on to talk about fidelity. So now we get down to cracking down. So banks do their own investigations to try to trace groups of bad checks or accounts to the same individuals. Last month, JP Morgan took some of them to court. In one case, JP Morgan said security cameras showed how a masked man walked to an ATM on August 29th and deposited a $335,000 check in a Houston area man's account. The next day, the bank said the man withdrew the money in chunks. Banks have also pressed law enforcement officials to pursue charges. So, and then they go on to some other, topics. And it says, but local and federal agents lack resources to investigate every case. Banks need to connect the dots, do all the investigations, said David Maimam, head of fraud insights at CennyLink, a fraud detection technology company. It takes a lot of time to do that. Deterrence is something that's missing. That's why folks are comfortable doing this. They're brazen. So let's talk about a couple of things here real quick. So number one is you had this law that passed many years ago called Check 21. And basically, Check 21 basically says that, when a bank gets deposited, the bank has to process that check within 24 hours. And it has really sped up the processing of checks. Like banks used to use a thing, which they still do, but it's perhaps not as prevalent as it was in years past, called the float. You deposit a check and the bank would hold it for X number of days, and the bank would make a little bit of profit every night off of the float of your deposit. Again, the banks still have a little bit of float, but it's nowhere near as much as it used to be. Now, the largest banks can still make a decent amount of money off the float, because if you have hundreds of billions of dollars flowing through your deposit accounts every night, you could still kind of maximize some earnings off of that. But my point here, though, is that Check 21 made, checks had to just go through and get processed a lot faster. So what you're seeing there is that helped to cut down on a little bit of the fraud over time. And what a lot of banks basically say is that, okay, say you come in with like a $5,000 check. I think a lot of banks out there are basically going to say, okay, you put the $5,000 check in. They're not going to make all $5,000 available right away. They're going to make probably, $2,000 available right away. And then say you're going to have to wait 3 days or whatever to get that, to get the rest of that $3,000, so the bank can make sure that the check clears, so that if it does turn out to be fraud, they're at least trying to minimize the amount of loss that they're taking on that check. Now, and again, a lot of times with the scammers, like they're not going to be able to take these things out in chunks. They're looking for that hit right away. Like I said, they're looking to put that $5,000 deposit in, get the $2,000 available, and then snatch that $2,000 right away before the bank realizes that it's a fraudulent check, and then they try to get that money and run out. Now, part of the issue is that they've got to use people to try to deposit the money into their accounts, and so there's a lot of I guess you could call them mules and other things that go on there. People that open legitimate accounts and they kind of get sucked into these fraud schemes and that kind of thing. Now, I will also say that the number of checks, while there's still a lot of checks used every year in the United States, the overall number of checks has come down significantly. The problem lies in, if you get rid of checks, what are you going to use to replace them? And I know everybody talks about, oh, well, payment channels and, Venmo and stuff like that. Well, Venmo, especially that might be more practical for consumers, but for a business, if you got to write somebody a $50,000 check, you're not going to Venmo somebody 50 grand. Again, you may not want to wire the money because there may not be a need to wire the money, and because the person most likely is local, so you can either mail a check back to them for services performed, or you could drop a check off to them or give them a check when they come by, whatever the case may be. But the check is still a very good practical payment channel for transferring the money that you need to make the payment to a customer or a vendor in a very easy fashion. So again, I think this whole thing is going to continue, unfortunately, as long as paper checks are utilized. But I think until you do have advances on the way. Payment channels becoming more advanced. You have Fed now. You've got other things coming online. So maybe it will be possible in the next 10 years to maybe dramatic. I don't think we'll be able to completely get rid of checks. Some people, and the other thing is, like, some people still love to use checks for, like, donations, if you're donating to charities and stuff like that. Again, there's still a lot of great uses for checks. And I don't think that there has been this, if there was a perfect solution that, you could just use, other instant payments and stuff like that. If that was out there, then nobody would use checks, but that doesn't exist yet. So, like I said, it's an interesting, it's just a very interesting thing to look at. Like I said, on the one hand, the check fraud continues unabated. We saw in the article there's been a 400% increase in check fraud, just in the last year or so. And so it's a big issue for banks. It's a big issue for small businesses. It's a big issue for consumers. And banks continue to invest in new, what they call regulatory technology, to try to combat the check fraud, try to reduce it, and try to keep the customer safe. They recommend that customers use things like systems like Positive Pay to try to make sure that the checks you're putting through, that nothing fraudulent is getting through there, or so there's a lot of different technology and different methods that are being employed right now to try to cut down on the fraud, but it just remains a major issue. So like I said, that's the issue there with checks at the moment. And again, like many of the topics I cover here, it's just something we'll have to continue to monitor, see how things happen, see how things change. So I will wrap up with this. If you like this episode, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as that always helps the channel. Remember, we are on YouTube, Rumble, and all major podcast platforms. Please be sure to leave your comments down below, as I always love getting back to everybody, and make sure to check out some of the other content on the channel. And with that, I bid everybody a fond farewell, and I will see you again real soon. Thanks.